went into a very peaceful, state. And this was when I was physically dead. I was clinically dead at that time. It was very peaceful. I was moving into a very calm environment, and a voice said almost identically the same thing: "Don't worry, you're going home." And at that point, it went into what people describe as a light. I saw a light in the distance. Every significant event in my life flashed before my eyes. It was like a mental review inside my brain about everything that had happened throughout my life.
Kia ora, hello, I'm back again, Kirsty Salisbury here, chatting with our guest today, who is Steve Sayre, who is a two-time near-death experiencer, having died twice on the operating table after serious military injury. He's also a former top-secret operative for the US Army Intelligence, and he has a lot of personal stories when it comes to death. Steve is also the producer of the hit docu-film, which is called Ghosts and the Afterlife, a scientific investigation. And this docu-film covers a lot of the topics that we cover here on the Near Death podcast. We're talking about near-death experiences, after-death communication. He taps into stories around ghosts and paranormal experiences and all of these juicy topics. So I'm really excited by our conversation today. Ghosts in the Afterlife has been one of the best-selling lists of Amazon, Vindu, iTunes, and Walmart since its release a few months ago, and it's been voted the best documentary film of 2022 at the TZIFF Film Festival. So it's had quite a lot behind it. It's a fascinating docu-film, and we'll have links to that just down below in the show notes. So Steve Sayre, welcome to the Let's Talk Near Death podcast.
Thank you.
Where do we start with your story? Are you happy to start with your near-death experiences?
Yes, I always differentiate between NDEs and ADEs because near-death experiences, a lot of people have experiences where they nearly die. They're in comas, they're not able to sense what's happening from a physical perspective, and they're seeing themselves outside their body, etc., because they've been seriously traumatized physically. But that's a near-death experience in my definition. Then you have an after-death experience where somebody actually physically, technically is dead. They're no longer breathing, their heart's no longer beating, and for an extended period of time. That's an after-death experience from my perspective. And that's what I experienced on two occasions in close proximity. After the injury took place and I was in the hospital, then they were preparing me for some type of exploratory surgery. They weren't entirely sure what was happening or what they were going to do at that point. And then that's the first time I flatlined. And after I flatlined, the nurse was very upset and confused. She was very young, and she handled the defibrillator paddles in order to get them prepared for the cardiologist, but she handed the cardiologist the handles without gelling the defibrillator pads. Now they have much smaller pads. They have much different types of ways of defibrillating that are less invasive, in the sense that with the older paddles, which were about this long, this wide, and basically covered both sides of the chest almost entirely. So the doctor didn't even think about whether or not the paddles were gelled, and he just, did the defibrillation, which burned off the skin on both sides of my chest, because that's what happened when the defibrillators at that time were applied without a gel. It may still be the case. I just know the paddles now are much smaller than they used to be. And that didn't bring me back. And I don't know what they did for about 10, 15 minutes from what there were three nurses. There was an open heart surgeon, a cardiologist, and three nurses at the time. And they all remained together throughout the whole process. the cardiologist was attempting to bring me back, and but there was too much internal bleeding, not from the defibrillation, from the previous injury that brought me to the hospital. And then subsequent to that, I went into a very peaceful state. And this was when I was physically dead. I was clinically dead at that time. And then I heard a voice not long after saying, "Don't worry, you're going home." And I just thought, where's home? It wasn't a subconscious voice in my mind, which a lot of people try to impose, saying, "Oh, you just heard that because you're trying to calm yourself through your subconscious." It confused me because I had no home, because all through my life, from the age of 2 years old, my family was traveling. Every year or two, they'd move from one country to another and one home to another. And then in the military, I had the same experience. So I thought, where's that? I was utterly clueless why I was being told I was going home. And then it continued on for quite some time. And then at some point, one of the defibrillations worked and it brought me back to life. And I, looked around the facility, and I was told it wouldn't be long before I died again because there was such extensive bleeding, and they had to do emergency open heart surgery, and the cardiologist kept saying sign, 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 because they didn't know that they had to do it initially. But then the open heart surgeon said, "There's no need for him to sign. This is an emergency situation. He's already died once." He said, "We need to take him into surgery. You can't debate somebody that's been dead for 10, 15 minutes. So while they're rolling me into surgery, the same thing occurred. The heart stopped, I flatlined, and went into another 10, 15 minutes approximately, according to the same operations nurse that I spoke to, obviously, a couple of days after this event. And at that time, it was very similar. It was very peaceful. I was moving into a very calm environment, and a voice said almost identically the same thing: "Don't worry, you're going home." And at that point, it went into what people describe as a light. I saw a light in the distance, and then they started to administer the anesthesia. When they administered the anesthesia, I lost consciousness. In other words, even when I was clinically dead, I didn't lose consciousness. But when they administered the anesthesia, I lost consciousness. In other words, I had no awareness at that stage. Then I woke up in the middle of the open heart surgery. And then I would see I saw my chest fillet open, and they're cutting around at the heart and doing their thing, and the reflective light above the surgeon. And I was on, and I just thought, well, just stay calm, just let him get this done. And it seemed like forever. The surgery lasted 5 hours. So it felt like I was awake for about 45 minutes. And so it's an incredibly stressful thing to watch and endure for 45 minutes. So I started to try to communicate with him. Although, of course, you're intubated, your lungs are breathing for you, your heart's being pumped. Well, the heart is disconnected. The blood flow is going through a blood pump. So I started to make sounds, and, they saw my eyes open and me looking around, and then they administered way too much anesthesia, which created another issue, but it knocked me out, certainly, for a long time. They almost couldn't bring me back. It was way overdone, the anesthesia. I guess they thought I was like a horse, and they had to really knock me out. The guy went overboard the second time around because he went underboard the first time, so he went overboard the second time. But that was the experience I had that relates to an ADE, an after-death experience, those two experiences. I've also had a near-death experience which I'll bring up because it's interesting in certain respects. When people have a near-death experience where they nearly die and they think that it's definitely unequivocally the end, they often talk about their life flashing before their eyes, which I just thought that was a turn of phrase. It wasn't really something that happened. But in this case, it was a 55-mile-an-hour head-on collision, and the other car came from obviously the other side of the highway directly into my car. Now, during that approximately 3/4 of a second, I realized there was nothing I could do. There was no possibility. My right leg was going toward the brake pedal, but at the same time, I knew that it wasn't going to do much good. But as it was heading there, it hit the pedal, and then, of course, the car also collided with the other car. But what I found interesting is what also happened during that 3/4 of a second is every significant event in my life flashed before my eyes. It was like a mental review inside my brain about everything that had happened throughout my life. And I always thought your life flashed before your eyes was something you would say because it was, just something somebody made up and everyone started using that terminology. Because of the amount of time you would have to have everything flash before your eyes, which in a situation where you're about to die is generally a fraction of a second, that couldn't possibly be enough time, but it was. And that's what really shocked me after the fact, because I was able to have an entire life review in that 3/4 of a second.
That's amazing, because we hear quite a bit about life reviews with near-death experiences when they're either out of body or they're in some other kind of realm. But you're saying that you had the life review in your physical body. There wasn't necessarily, was there a big impact? You talk about a near-death experience as in a near miss rather than having the collision. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, well, the near-death experience is where you nearly die. And I've spoken and we interviewed a great number of people who had near-death experiences. Their heart didn't stop, they didn't stop breathing. They just had a very traumatic injury. And the very traumatic injury caused them to have a near-death experience where they saw their injured body outside from their body, overlooking their bodies from the hospital room ceiling and seeing what was happening with the physician and the nurses in the room and things of that nature, which I'm sure you've heard dozens of times. But they don't necessarily die. Most of them don't. They just have an experience where they're severely traumatized, severely injured, and they're just experiencing something that has taken their consciousness to a different level. But in this case, the 3/4 of a second or half a second before the collision, after the collision occurred, of course, I lost consciousness. And what happened during that period of time, I'm not sure. My estimate from everything that was taking place, it was probably a period of maybe 5 minutes. And I say that because when I regained consciousness, I looked around, and first thing I wanted to know if I could move, because, were the legs able to move and such. And I looked around and I saw, what was happening. And the car that had come over the other side and hit my car, the impact was such that it threw the other car all the way over to the other side of the intersection and landed into the back of a van at the red light on the other side of the highway. So the collision, and then my car was just pushed in like an accordion. But from the fact that the driver that ran into me, she was there, and it seemed odd to me because she hadn't gotten out of the car, so I assumed she was severely injured or something else was happening. And then the other situation that seemed interesting was the person that was in the van. who wasn't injured, but she was traumatized. But I wondered why, when I woke up, she was still sitting, like in a trance. And so I took all this in and kind of looked around, trying to figure out what I should do next. Then I saw smoke coming out of the car that ran into me out of the front. So I thought, well, maybe that car is going to catch fire. So I got out of my car. Fortunately, I just had to do a lot of pushing on the door because it was pretty banged up. I went over across the street, and she was in her car, not because she was shocked, which is interesting because the person that ran into me was trapped in her car because her car was jammed and she couldn't open it. And the one in the van, who wasn't even scratched, the back of her van was all banged up from the car hitting her, but she wasn't physically injured in any way, shape, or form. She was just in a state of shock. So then when I pried the one person out of her car, and then we got the other person out of her minivan. It was a small minivan. And then after that, the emergency services showed up. But that's part of a category of a near-death experience in my mind. You almost physically died. And there was a great deal of trauma that there was brain injury, et cetera, and injuries to various different bones and such in the body, obviously through the impact. So it was a near-death experience, and then of course the two after-death experiences, but they were both very different.
Gosh, you've had quite a lot go on, haven't you? Quite a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure you must have seen quite a lot of stuff when you were in the military.
Oh, yes.
A lot happens. Yeah.
I never asked about it. In other words, when we were on patrol and one person got riddled with machine gun fire, he was the only one hit in the platoon. He was also the only one that ran. So it was kind of an odd situation, but there was no questions asked because he was quite dead, so I never actually, and I wasn't really investigating the subject matter when I was in the military, just trying to avoid it.
Yeah, I bet. Hanging on for life, just trying to get through, I'm sure. Yeah. So how did that then lead into wanting to investigate? You've got your docu-film Ghosts in the Afterlife, which was very, very interesting. How did that come about? Was that quite some time after your death experiences?
Yes, it was. It initially was my brother's idea, and he just was very intrigued with the subject matter. And he said, you've died twice and you've had all these different injuries, et cetera, that you've had these experiences, you would be, you'd be perfect to do the investigations into this. He wound up doing a lot of the investigations. And then I wound up doing almost all the technical work. So it initiated with my brother Garrett, who just insisted, for all intents and purposes, that I complete this documentary and get it done. And the amount of time that it took was extraordinary. 12 years. I mentioned to you earlier, the first film we did, which was an action adventure drama, only took 2 years, which is very common. At the time, I thought, this is crazy. Why is it taking so long? 2 years. And then we did another film with Mark Cuban, which was, I guess you'd call it a drama. This was back in 1995. It was called Lost at Sea, and it was distributed in England and Australia. I don't know if it ever got to New Zealand. It was never finished. So it got distributed in its unfinished form because someone stole it out of the film storage before the film was done. But it was distributed around the world in different countries. Ironically.
I'm fascinated that back then it only took 2 years to do the first one that you did. And yet with the internet, with our ability to jump on and do video calls like we're doing right now and get the global exposure, get global stories and connections, that it actually took longer. It took full 12 years when we have the world at our fingertips. No
Yeah,
small feat at all, Steve. I'm really, really impressed. Like I say, I really enjoyed the film. You touched on quite a few topics. Was there one particular topic or part of that docu-film that came out for you? Was there one thing that really spoke to you?
I imagine since I'd experienced the phenomenon a few times, nothing surprised me. I was unaware of the Stargate program with Skip Atwater, Captain Skip Atwater, which was a top secret program back in the 60s and 70s where they were doing remote viewing studies to determine how effectively they could then see what the enemy was doing overseas, which at that time, of course, was the Soviet Union. So it's interesting from that perspective because the uh, the studies were being done and attempting to determine what the Soviet Union was doing, what technologies they were about to come up with against our forces, because at that time we were in the Cold War. And they used this process called remote viewing, where they interviewed all the people that they thought had the most potential to remote view. And they found certain people that had extraordinary capabilities of looking thousands of miles away into areas in the Soviet Union in order to determine what they were going to do next.
Wow, it's amazing, isn't it? Have you gone down the track of remote viewing any further? Have you looked at other case studies or how this works?
Well, the only case studies we in the film that we looked into were the Stargate program studies because they were the most interesting that we could find. And I think one of the reasons why the film, and one of the primary reasons the film took 12 years, was finding these legitimate
Mm,
studies, these legitimate people to interview, and then getting them to acquiesce to an interview was a lot of the time very difficult because they were involved in ongoing research that they
mm.
really didn't necessarily want to make public. So that took a great deal of time. And then interviewing and interviewing and interviewing and finding the right people that actually brought the information forward in a way that people could consume in an entertaining but also informative way. And that combination is often very difficult to find.
Oh, yes, definitely. And one thing I really loved about your work, Steve, was that even in the title, it's a scientific investigation. So it was really backed by research, and it was so much more than just people's stories and experiences. And I feel like that added a lot of weight to it, added a lot of value and credibility to what we were watching within that docufilm. There was one part, this has actually, I've thought about this quite a lot since I watched it. There was the lady in the laundromat, and I think I wrote to you about this. She had a paranormal experience where the chairs were moving and there were all sorts of things going on. It blew my mind to be able to watch that, and I feel like that was a great gift to be able to see some of these things in play.
Yeah, that was CCTV footage that the documentary crew, not our crew, but another crew, they were taking various different CCTV footage from this complex where they'd had various different sightings and not necessarily sightings per se, but uh, things that took place. People would disappear in this particular building and
Mm,
they could never be located. So they set up all these CCTV cameras and then they recorded off of some of the screens that were because the this was some time ago, this footage, as you could tell by the quality of the footage. So they recorded off the screens because they didn't have the technologies with the little chips back and forth.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they recorded off the actual CCTV screen. And we were just notified that the footage existed and we acquired the footage and incorporated it into the film, which was how we went about all the footage that we had that wasn't taken by us directly.
Mm, mm. I just found it fascinating. I'm not sure if you've had paranormal experiences yourself. There was also the one with the hotel, wasn't there, where there was some noise and disturbance in a hotel room, and then they went up there and it was empty.
Yeah, it was
And
just torn apart, but it was empty.
yeah, kind of. it intrigued me, but there's a side of me that's like, oh, that's a little bit creepy. That's a little bit spooky. I find it really interesting. We haven't talked a whole lot about paranormal experiences on the podcast show yet, but it is something which I do get quite a few questions around. Uh, do you think that these experiences are particularly common?
Well, it depends on the paranormal experiences in general. I don't think they're common, although I think they happen often because we have approximately 8 billion people in the world. And so, the 8 billion people and you have 100,000 experiences isn't that often, but it's a very large number of
Mm.
experiences.
That's a really good point, actually. And I think that's where having the world at our fingertips and having our global connection through internet, Wi-Fi, things like this really helps to be able to bring those stories out. And I think that's the same with near-death experiences as well, is that we now have the ability to hear more of them. Back before the internet, pre-internet days, there wasn't so much way that we could find out about these experiences. So people would sit where they were in their own location, feeling quite isolated, feeling like they were the only one for some time that this had happened to. Were they crazy? Did it really happen? Whereas now, all of this is at our fingertips. We can go and find other people around the world who've had similar experiences. So I like what you say about how maybe the incident rate isn't that high, but across the world, there's quite a lot of them happening. So it gets the population, it's not that high, but there are a lot of events happening.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then if you have, not all those incidents are genuine, but
Well,
it's like,
that's it.
right. And that's true of any profession, which I always tell people, and it always shocks them. It's an
Mm,
epiphany for some people, and other people just think, oh, he's exaggerating. But there's only about 2 to 3% of any profession that's competent, truly competent in their professional activities. When you come to the more complex professions, like being a medical doctor, being an attorney, there's so much information they not only have to remember, but assimilate and being
mm,
able to come to rational conclusions based on all that knowledge. Most people aren't able to retain the knowledge, and most people are completely incapable of assimilating it. So the vast majority of doctors and attorneys are either semi-competent or incompetent, unfortunately. I know that doesn't make people feel too terrific about when they're in a courtroom or when
yeah.
they're in surgery, but I always tell people to be very sure that they research their surgeon and their medical doctors and their dentists, anything that's an important aspect of your life, very, very carefully.
Oh, yeah. I like this because I'm always talking about how I'm a skeptic. I like to question a lot of things, not out of being negative, but I think we should look deeper. So I think that's probably another question I have for you, Steve, is how do we know if these experiences are real when we look at this footage of people having paranormal? Because I actually see quite a lot of it online. And then you go further down into it and you realize actually it wasn't real. Somebody made that just to get, I don't know, whatever reason they did that for, but it's made up, it's not genuine. So how do you feel that we can trust what we see? How do we know what we're seeing is real?
The best that you can do when it's third-party footage, as you know, we don't have much third-party footage in the film. There's probably 5 little clips, and those are the ones that we found that we researched and did the best we could to get the background and the source and verify the source and have video analysis to determine if there's been any type of manipulation of the images. That's the
Mm,
best you can do. And then, of course, when you're experiencing yourself, that's inevitably the very best because you know it's happening.
mm,
Then, of course, when we did the one little, and of course, the film is mostly about consciousness after physical death. It's not so much about ghosts as we know it, like Zach Baggins wandering around in the dark and getting goosed by a ghost. It's, who the hell knows if he was goosed by a ghost or he just decided to go, out. I mean,
yeah.
those types of things. Maybe he is being goosed by a ghost every week. We don't know. But that's to your point, is like we have to assume that whoever's doing whatever they're doing is doing it because it's actually happening when it's a performance. I mean, if it's a performance, or is it actually happening? Because when they said, "Did you hear that?" You know, if someone throws a pencil during filming, you'll hear click, click, click. You know, if someone mumbles in the background, you'll hear that. So those types of things, of course, we didn't include in the film. They're too subjective, and there's no way to know what's going on. It fascinates a lot of people, but we wanted to stick to the scientific method of doing everything we could to exclude anything that seemed questionable. And then when we did our own ghost hunt, you know, that was interesting because we spent 2 days and 2 nights out in the middle of nowhere, out in the forest area. It was like 10 miles above Malibu. So it wasn't like we're out in the Mojave Desert. We were out in the middle of nowhere as far as you can get, as far as Los Angeles County is concerned. It was, as you saw in the film, it's just forest area and mountains.
Yeah.
And I thought we had nothing, because the whole time, there was one time the on-camera narrator, Kelsey Boland, said, "Did you see that?" And nobody saw anything, but a lot of things happened. A little meter went off, the dog started whining and refused to move forward, and I didn't see anything. No one else saw anything. She wasn't even sure what she saw. She thought she saw some lights going across the field. But when I was doing the post-production, just looking at it, saying, "Is anything I can make of this? Is there any?" Because when you take hundreds of hours of footage, you always look for something you hope usable. And then I saw this kind of a Predator-like image, if you remember the film Predator,
Yeah.
where you see directly through this image, you see the trees and the bushes through this image as it's moving across screen, but it's clearly anthropogenic. You see it as a human with the legs and the arms moving from right screen to left screen.
Yeah. I mean, it was very, the way that you done, guess you'd kind of highlighted it to us in the film, but it was very clear what we were looking at there. Going back to your own experiences, your own death experiences, have you thought much about why they happened to you, what they were for, how they took place?
Well, one of the near-death experience in the 55-mile-an-hour head-on collision, I thought about, you know, why would you have this life review? What's the point of it? It wasn't something that I anticipated. It wasn't something that I had any interest in having, so to speak. So I thought, well, what are the scientific probabilities here? And I think of scientific probabilities as being both in the spiritual and physical realm. And I really think everything is physical when you take it from a holistic perspective, because as spirituality exists, it's physical to the point that it exists. So I was thinking, why does this happen? Why does this take place? And there were two things that came to mind. One is that you're uploading your consciousness, so your consciousness can then live on in the next dimension, because all your memories are what your consciousness is actually composed of. And then the other possibility, and it could both be actually taking place simultaneously, is this information is being reviewed by a higher power, determining what direction you're going. Are you going up, or are you going down? Because it just happens like that. Everything you've done in your life, when in that fraction of a second. So those are two possibilities. They could be independently likely, or they could be an entirely a complement of one another. In other words, they both take place simultaneously.
Okay. Did you feel like you came out of those experiences with any clear-cut purpose or message or feeling of anything that you had to do with your life?
Well, each time I had a very severe injury or death, I was always focused on saying, all right, I'm going to not only recover, but actually surpass whatever level I was at intellectually and physically than I was preceding that traumatic event. That's always the way I've handled trauma throughout my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kept me motivated to continue to recover and then attempt to surpass whatever level I was at preceding the injuries.
Yeah.
Or preceding death. The other.
Right. Okay. And did you ask why me? Why did this happen to me?
No, I never did.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
No, I knew it had happened. That was the extent of it.
Yeah. I can definitely feel that you have quite a resilience to you, Steve. I guess having a background in military as well, that there's an element of that that's been brought in. And yeah, there's definitely that element of resilience. And like you said, wanting to do better, wanting to improve. You've then gone out and made all these movies and done a lot of really important things, I suppose. Did you ever feel like you had any direction or leading you to do these things? Is it a little bit like a life purpose event, or are you just taking each day as it comes?
Well, actually, after I kept, one recovery after another, and there were many more, but not relevant to this subject matter, I started to think, well, I have to do something truly extraordinary with my life because I kept recovering from things that
Yeah.
normally would recover from. And so hopefully in the future, I will do something quite extraordinary, and in a positive sense.
Yeah. I love that you haven't really thought too much about why did this happen. It's really just it happened and let's move on and get on with life. And I hope I do something really good with my life. I really like that. I feel like there's an element of living in the moment in that statement. I find it quite hard to live in the moment sometimes. I can be really caught up. I also had my own near-death experience. I feel like you say that I really want to do something positive with my life and really want to do something significant, but I don't necessarily know what that is. And so there is also an element of going day by day and just hoping I stumble across it, hoping I stumble into life purpose. Have you had a thought around life purpose and what that might be for you? Do you think your film was connected into that?
Well, it may be a stepping stone, and certainly I think that the film will bring a great number of people a great deal of solace.
Mm,
But I don't think it is anywhere near the accomplishment that I need to attain. I don't know how well the film will ultimately do. Hopefully, it does exceptionally well. It's only been out a few months, and the film market as it is today, it kind of builds momentum. But with independent films, it's really accumulative. We're with Vision Films, and they're a very good company, and they've had other very significant successes. But those successes, sometimes it was the success took place as far as the real significant portion of the success, like 2 years after the film was released.
yeah. Wow. Going back to your experiences, how is your health today? Are you all good? Because I know that you've had injuries. I know that there's always a traumatic side that comes along with these experiences. How are you going today?
Fortunately, I'm in excellent health, which
Right.
is hard to believe. Um, yeah, it's fortunate that I just was able to recover. I mean, during the surgery that took place due to the injury to the heart, it took many years to recover, but they told me after the surgery, said, you have maybe 10, 15 years at the max.
Oh,
And,
really?
and that's it. That's all you can expect because there's so much damage to the heart. Sorry, well, it seemed like a significant amount of time. I said, I'll do my best. But that was over 30 years ago. So
Yeah.
they evidently were wrong. The body and the mind have an extraordinary ability to reconstitute themselves and to recover if you do everything you can to make it happen.
Mm, yep, I definitely believe in that. How How do you think that played out in terms of feeling like you've got a limited amount of time? Do you feel like that changed the way that you lived? Did it change your long-term perspective on life or?
Um, no, I don't think it did actually at that time. My focus was on fully recovering because when they said that, I said, well, maybe, maybe not.
Mm,
I was more than aware that doctors didn't have the holy grail uh, to what was going to happen or what wasn't going to happen. So I just thought, well, it might be true, who knows? And I just thought, what I will do though is I'll take the comments seriously and do everything intellectually, spiritually, and physically to recover fully from the injuries. So that was the only thing, was focusing on recovery because I had injuries preceding that, and that's how I always dealt with it.
mm. We never know how things are going to go, do we? I know people have had a life-limiting diagnosis, a terminal diagnosis, and actually then gone into recovery and lasted way, way longer than the amount of months or years or time that the medical professionals have given them. And I can understand where they're coming from, the medical people. I can understand they're just trying to help, they're trying to do their thing. But it just goes to show that we never know how this is all going to unfold. We never know what's around the corner, whether it's you call a near-death experience, a near miss, something that's going to be a significant event in our life, what we have to achieve. And I think it's so personal. I love how you talk about, I'm just trying to get well. I was just focused on healing, all these good things.
It took years because what happened during the process, the heart was so damaged it couldn't maintain a steady beat and it kept stopping. So
Oh,
you might
scary.
say I had a lot of many after death experiences. These didn't last long, but they're very unsettling because the heart would literally stop for like 10, 15 seconds. Of course, everything would go
Oh,
black. And then I'd come back like an electrical shock. So they said, okay, we're going to have to put a pacemaker in your heart.
yeah.
Otherwise, at some point it won't start again. And I
Yeah.
said, no, I said, I think you've done enough. I'm alive and I'll either die or I'll live. I'll live or I'll die because I didn't want to live dependent on a machine transplanted into my
Wow.
heart. And that took about a year and a half before that stopped happening. So it was a year and a half of being under a great deal of anticipation and stress during that portion of the recovery.
So what's your relationship with the idea that you're going to die? You seem to be so okay with that. You're like, well, don't put the pacemaker in. I'll either live or die. Do you feel quite at home with the idea that you're going to die?
I don't really think of physical death as actual death. It's
Yeah.
just
Okay.
it's one phase of our lives, and we'll move on to the next dimension, whatever that dimension may be. And I don't want to be in this physical dimension being physically, substantially physically handicapped.
Yes.
So my mind was either, look, if it's going to be a significant physical handicap that I cannot overcome, then let's just call it a day. That's
Yeah.
it. Like one of the injuries, they were transporting me in an ambulance and I was quadriplegic at that time. And I just said, slow down, it's over. And all I could do was talk. I couldn't move my arms. I couldn't even move my head from left to right. I could just blink and speak. And I
Oh
just
my
thought
goodness.
that's it. I don't know how anyone can tolerate that type of paralysis, and want to continue. But there are some people that actually do, which is quite extraordinary to me because I cannot imagine it. But that's always the perspective I had. If there's something where I'm going to be physically devastated but remain in this physical world, I'd rather go on to the next dimension and
Oh,
see what that's like.
yeah. I relate to that as well. I'm okay with the concept of dying. And like you, I do believe that actually we don't truly die, that we physically transition into something else. So yeah, gosh, that would be so terrifying. You've been through so much, Steve. You've got so many experiences. Absolutely fascinating. I'm really grateful that you've come on and shared your experiences with us. You've talked about your docu-film, Ghosts in the Afterlife, which is really interesting. You have got me thinking about quite a few different things through watching that. So your work is certainly making an impact, and I'm really grateful for you coming on and sharing your story today. Thanks very
Oh,
much.
great speaking with you.